Hello, this is a Green Report where uploads show the environment and the people whose decisions impact the world around us. I'm Iya Gozum,
And I'm Jee Geronimo.
and the annual Climate Summit, or COP28, is finally over. So, what happened? Yun yung tanong. To make it make sense, we're joined by Avril de Torres, Deputy Executive Director of think tank Center for Energy, Ecology, and Development. Hi, Av. Welcome back to the Philippines.
Hi,
Welcome.
hi,
Welcome.
G. Thank
Thanks
you.
for giving your time for this Green Report episode. So, the European Commission for Climate Action said that we've arrived at the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. So, totoo ba yun?
Question mark.
Question mark. And that humanity has finally done what is long overdue. You've come from Dubai, you've seen what happened there. Is this excited, eager sentiment something shared by people who attended the annual summit?
I don't think it's a shared sentiment especially among civil society organizations. There is some truth, no, na the end of fossil fuels has started.
Yeah.
It's something that we have been working towards even before COP28. But we're glad to finally see some recognition of the role of fossil fuels in this climate crisis and have that inserted into the text. So yes, the end of fossil fuels is here. It's starting, pero are we excited? Are we happy at the end of COP? Not really. A lot of frustration, a lot of sense of for some anger with how the COP28 ended. Pero some of us still went home with renewed hope, still in despite the outcomes.
Ikaw ba personally, were you angry? Were you frustrated? Were you hopeful coming back to the Philippines?
I think it's a mixed bag of emotions.
Yeah.
all of the above.
I'm tired, siguro.
Yes, and exhausted, really, diba? Pero we take COP for what it is. We know what are the limitations at the conference. This has been happening for 28 years. And we know that the real work happens at home.
Right.
And not in the 2 weeks that we spend in the conference, wherever that may be.
The real work happens at home.
At
I think, wrap up na po natin.
Thank you.
May quotable quote.
Yun na po yung quote.
But speaking of the text, which I guess the biggest news out of COP nga is the language of the text where fossil fuel finally went there. So sabi doon, transitioning away from, it says, transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science.
Sabi ng Reuters, that's a mouthful.
Ang dami nga.
Dami.
So,
Yeah.
what do we make of this? And what do we think of the phrases phase down and phase out, which has been in contention for a couple of years? What do you think about this new line in the decision text?
It's in simple terms, watered down or weakened text. No, for those who have been following the COP negotiations for years, we know that we have been trying to insert full, funded, fair, feminist phase out of fossil fuels in the text. And in the building blocks of the global stocktake text, we actually saw one of the options there state phase out of fossil fuels. So, and that's because of, over 100 countries saying that we need that translated into text. And of course, that's the outcome of years and for some decades of calling for a fossil fuel phase out. Diba? But given the circumstances of COP, we know that balance of forces are uneven at COP. And this COP is held in a petro-state. And the president is also the head of one of the biggest oil-producing companies in the world. The text that was drafted by the presidency didn't use phase out of fossil fuels, even though it was one of the options. We ended up with transitioning away from fossil fuels. In keeping with the science, doesn't say 1.5. We know that science provides different pathways, different models, and there are two different goals: 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius. And for climate vulnerable countries like the Philippines, we know the difference half a degree Celsius makes. Diba? It can impact hundreds of millions of lives. So, pros and cons, it's finally in the text. A lot of groups welcomed it. We welcome it. But the fact that we say it's historic, that it's landmark,
right?
diba? It's only a testament of the failures of this COP process. Kasi 28 conferences, ngayon lang natin nilagay sa text. That's why it's historic, right? But that's long overdue. That should have happened decades ago.
Right.
Actually, meron akong nabasa na newsletter. Parang sabi nila, well, madali naman mag-throw around ng words like historic, landmark, especially for a deal na 28 years na kasi natin itong pinag-uusapan.
Yes.
So, parang kahit na even the bare minimum, 'di ba? I mean, you're an advocate, you would call that a bare minimum. To insert transition away from fossil fuels, that kind of recognition, 'di ba? It's a bare minimum, but we flaunt it like historic, landmark, because it's been dragging on for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I wouldn't even call it bare minimum. For me, a bare minimum would say keeping 1.5.
Yeah,
right.
Aligned with 1.5. Kasi, grabe yung nangyayari on the ground. And this is, for me, a very emotional COP. We see heads of delegations from AOSIS, Alliance of Small Island States, being very emotional at the negotiating tables and talking about a world past 1.5 is a world of loss and damage. And those are their words. And talking about how when the text finally came out and countries are going to decide, they were saying, we're not going to sign our death warrant. So ako, bare minimum is, we know the global stock take has been happening for months. It didn't happen in the 2 weeks in Dubai. We know that we're off track, and we know what that means to communities and to people. And we didn't put that into text. Diba?
Parang goosebumps. Hearing them call it a death warrant. No, because it's really a life and death situation for some people, for many people.
Yes.
So there's also a section that recognizes the role of transitional fuels. Ang seed dyan, marami silang, hindi pala marami, pero very consistent yung messaging and yung campaign nyo against transitional fuels. Anong stance nyo dito na nakapasok tong section na to sa final text?
Actually, interestingly, before that, the final text, the draft before that didn't have transition fuels.
Oh, okay.
So it was one of those na pinasok sa final draft, although it was in previous iterations from the building blocks. Syempre, for us, that's another blow, no? Na for coming from a climate vulnerable country that's already dealing with so much climate impacts. We know what they mean when they say transition fuels. Diba? Ang number one dyan ay gas and LNG. And we know how much that's being promoted in the Philippines. And we can have a debate for hours about whether LNG and gas is a transition fuel. But the truth of the matter is we're promoting so much of that, and there's no roadmap for an exit. So this is a bridge that doesn't end for the Philippines context. And without that 1.5, without restrictions of, let's all agree that in the text we're going to meet 1.5, and then inserting a text on transition fuels, that just risks overshooting 1.5 more. So it's a very concerning one-liner in that long text. That's, again, one of those things that we're very frustrated to read.
Actually, there are groups talaga who say this is like a move backwards, given yung kung ano na yung mga na-achieve natin from the past COPs, if we even achieved anything. But I guess we have to, for our audience, we have to explain how these conferences go. Na normally texts like this, kaya actually it was supposed to end on December 12, but it ended December 13 because there were a lot of discussions and negotiations happening, and the process is that there should be a consensus among. So kailangan whatever text comes out of the conference, some way or another, nag-agree yung mga nations. But of course, for vulnerable countries, they would say na this is not the best text, but we have to, it should not fail.
And in negotiations like this, super critical ng semantics. The words that we use. Kaya, yun, walang phase out. Merong phase out, in fairness, phase out ng fossil fuel subsidies.
Subsidies.
Inefficient fossil fuels. All those adjectives and qualifiers, they matter.
Yes, they matter.
Sige, balik tayo dito sa Philippines naman. So the Philippines, we came out of COP28. Sabi natin, we're going to be part of the Loss and Damage Board Fund, which is an inaugural board. What do we think of this? This development? Of course we're we want to host the fund, but now that we're part of the board, what does that mean for the Philippines?
I think it's a very important development, no? Not just for the Philippines, but globally, because this means that the Philippines, one of the most climate vulnerable countries consistently the past 2 decades, gets a seat in an important table. The board decides what happens to the fund, and they get to champion loss and damage. So it's important that those who sit on that table understand what loss and damage is, not just the science, but what it actually means to communities. And we know that very well. Alam natin yan, ilang bagyo yung dumadaan sa atin.
Yeah.
Alam natin kung gaano kainit sa Pilipinas. Sea level rise is happening in some areas in the Philippines, and so on and so forth. And we can go on and on. Hindi mo kailangan maging scientist, kailangan mo lang maging Pinoy para malaman mo what loss and
Yeah,
damage
and
is.
a recent survey says na majority of Filipinos, di ba? They feel the effects of climate change.
Exactly. So that's very important na we get a seat at that table. But that also means a huge responsibility,
Right.
right?
Right.
But also, kasi, in the context of the Philippines and the negotiations, loss and damage, sobrang, Philippines is one of the nations talaga that pushed for a loss and damage fund, like, for years, for decades, di ba? So,
And we're the
to be-
poster child of loss and
Tayo
damage.
pa ba?
Di ba? With
Tayo pa ba?
Yolanda.
yeah,
That's true.
unfortunately, we are.
Who can forget our then negotiator Yebsanyo
Yeah.
crying
Yes.
in the negotiation halls, diba? Talking about Typhoon Haiyan, Yolanda, a decade
I know.
since,
na.
It's been a
decade
decade.
since, diba? And he called for a loss and damage, and that's when the loss and
So,
damage
grabe, no?
was
10
formed,
years.
diba? So mahalaga talaga it's important that we're in the board.
Right.
And even Environment Secretary said it's a long time coming. And that, we've earned that place. Because we've been pushing for this fund for so many years already.
But how about the hosting of the fund? What does that mean? Why are we pushing for it? And what does that say of this administration, our climate, the climate policies
of the Marcos
admin-
administration. Let's name it.
Ayun, of the Marcos administration.
Hosting is a different matter
I
from
know.
being a member of the board. No, that entails a lot of huge responsibility of being accountable for resources that are meant to go to communities affected by the climate crisis. So it means a responsibility for this administration to make sure that there's judicious use of these resources and that it goes to the communities who need them the most. It also means that we get to be a champion of loss and damage. Pero, alam mo, loss and damage it's just one side of a coin. Eh. The other side is mitigation.
Right.
And we can't talk about loss and damage without talking about phase out. And that's a question now. Does this admin champion that? We can talk about resources and how do we help communities that have suffered so much. But if we don't talk about the phase out part of it, and the Philippines does not take leadership in that, we pass 1.5, then that's a world of loss and damage. So again, one of the negotiators said this, there's not enough resources in the world to pay up for loss and damage in a world that's past 1.5.
Right.
And sabi mo nga, it's just one side of the coin. So aside from loss and damage, there's also adaptation funding, to help countries transition from fossil fuels to renewables. And with what we've achieved at COP28, or the lack thereof, on this side of funding, do you still think that that 1.5 is still feasible? And also kasi SEED had released a study, no? Now, can you also elaborate on that study?
That's very important. No, we call that in the climate conference jargon means of implementation. Finance is one of that. Technology, transfer and development, capacity building, all of these would be what would help us implement mitigation and adaptation. Currently, that's very weak. So that's true, no? Kahit naman we get the strongest language when it comes to phasing out fossil fuels, if we don't say, and the developed countries have that responsibility to provide the means of implementation, and they should lead, then the text is still missing. Because that's not just support, that's part of their responsibilities, that's part of their climate debt. It's developing nations who contributed the least to this crisis but are suffering the most. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that's why we're coming home frustrated. No? We don't have the finances that's necessary to make that happen. But is 1.5 still possible? Again, no, what I said earlier, the real work to end fossil fuels, to transition to a genuinely sustainably powered future, to meet 1.5, it doesn't happen in those negotiation halls. We know that even coming to COP.
Question lang, do you get tired of that question?
Yung is 1.5
Is it possible? Yung nasa parang, like, parang, is that something that should be asked na? Kasi parang, well, action na natin. Parang lagi lang siyang tinatanong.
Yeah.
Do you get tired of that question? Sorry, biglang, brain fart na, napapagod kaya si Av and other civil society organizations when media or other people or other officials keep asking, is it possible? Is it possible?
I don't think nakakapagod naman siya eh. It's part of the conversion process.
Okay.
Kasi very technical eh, diba?
Right, right.
We know we need to meet 1.5, but how do we get there? That's a technical conversation eh.
Right.
And I think it requires a lot of thinking out of the box. It requires a lot of technical and discussions and scientific discussions and modeling and simulations. Also, it requires a lot of hope. Diba? We can be jaded and say, wala na talaga yan, tignan mo naman yung COP and all that. But I think it's very much possible. And dito na ako magta-transition sa report. sa Philippines, so we were very fortunate to have commissioned a report from Climate Analytics, a global climate science and policy institute based in Berlin. And they're mainly famous for their project called Climate Action Tracker, which checks whether nationally determined contributions of countries are aligned with 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius or even beyond. But they also do research work and simulate pathways of a countries to meet 1.5. So we were able to commission a report from them. Anong itsura ng power sector ng Pilipinas pag 1.5 aligned? And we're very happy to learn that it's possible. Syempre, what it says is very drastic cuts on fossil fuels. Phase out coal by 2035, gas, LNG by 2040. And we have abundant renewable energy resources to meet current and future demand, but we would need international support.
Yeah.
Na hindi, I think ito yung kulang nga
Yes.
mula sa COP28. Like,
Yes.
there's frustration on the ground na walang yung pledges ng mga countries are not enough. And I mean, nag-introduce ka ng bagong fund when you have the adaptation fund nga na hindi nare-reach you. So all that conversation, it comes back to, is it because they don't want to take responsibility for what has happened, di ba? Kaya merong ganong debate on climate finance.
And that's a very tight schedule. Phasing out coal by 2035. No?
Yes, it is.
Kasi yes, it is. Period. So, anyway, the Philippines is also set to be a signatory of this pledge that seeks to triple renewable capacity and double energy efficiency. How does this pledge help out in the bigger picture of 1.5?
Yeah. That's a very welcome pledge because it's informed by International Energy Agency's net zero roadmap. So IEA is a recognized energy agency comprised of different nations and organizations, no? And they came up with this roadmap of how do we reach net zero by 2050. Yeah. And they said for renewable energy, that means tripling capacity by 2030 and then doubling energy efficiency, annual gains by 2030. That was translated into a pledge at the start of COP and then inserted into the text of the GSD outcome. So that's very welcome that the Philippines signed on to that after also civil society asked. No, parang, we weren't in the initial list. So we were asking the Philippine
It's
delegation.
Sa website.
Yes.
If you check, wala pa tayo.
Hindi pa na-update.
So kaya nga sabi ko, set pa lang. Set. Kasi
Hindi ka pa sure.
Hindi ko sure kung parang nag-sign na. Kasi
Yeah.
nag-sign na ba?
They've confirmed.
They've
confirmed.
confirmed.
So
Wala
we
lang
signed
pa sa
on.
website. Okay.
Yeah. we've asked, kasi wala nga sa initial list. And he
Yeah.
said, President is very clear, renewable energy is the way forward, renewable energy is the top climate agenda. So, it's good kasi they also say this is historic because it's the first time that we actually put into text the scale that is needed for renewable energy and energy efficiency. But, again, ang daming buts, no? It doesn't say that we do that to displace fossil fuels. And that's a big gap. Kasi we can triple our e-capacity by 2030. We can double energy efficiency gains annually by 2030. But if we don't displace fossil fuels, then 1.5 is still outside reach, right?
Right. Kasi parang madali ng, well, not madali, pero it's a positive look na, we're gonna triple, we're gonna double. Pero yun nga, tama, if we don't look at the other side of the coin na hindi kailangan i-phase out yung fossil fuels, then it's just
So would that
Yeah.
pledge mean that we'd have to also tweak our, di ba meron din tayong transition roadmap locally? So that would mean,
35% from 2030.
changes also in our local pledges.
In my opinion, it should. But the way we should read the pledge is that it's a global target,
Okay.
right? It doesn't really translate to nationally everyone has to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030 and so on because we have different contexts. And when it comes to timelines, developed countries should lead, right? So may ganun na aspect to it, and then the means of implementation. So are we being supported by the developed countries when it comes to technology development and transfer and capacity building? But it means that we are committing to work together with the global community, and that we know that that's a target under a net zero roadmap.
Right.
So hopefully, the intention is to meet 1.5 on our end. And if we are to look at the 1.5 report by Climate Analytics, that shows that hindi lang triple our capacity for the Philippines to meet 1.5, way more than that.
Yeah. So it's a global target. Again, yung big share ng pie, ng responsibility, goes to the big countries. Again.
Yes.
Sila ulit. Sisingilin lang natin sila na sisingilin up to COP whatever number.
Yeah.
So anyway, all this to say, the deal is not legally binding. Binding, right? Is it? Is it?
There's a long drawn debate
Right.
on whether Paris Agreement is binding, no? But there's a nuanced debate of what provisions are binding, which ones aren't, and that's why we take so much time arguing or negotiating
You're
about
a
the
lawyer.
semantics,
You're
right?
a lawyer. I mean, how do we pressure the parties to kasi hindi sila legally binded, or even the discussion kung legally binding siya, it's ongoing, it's there.
Yes,
Diba? It's
yes.
open.
You know, there are some who would say that that's one of the biggest strengths of the Paris Agreement. Lalo na if you try to trace its predecessors, the Kyoto Protocol and so on, is its capacity to keep parties keep going back to the negotiating tables.
Even if it's not.
That's exactly
Okay.
one of the reasons why they keep coming back. But I would argue naman no, that there are certain provisions that are binding, and it also matters what states do when they go back. For instance, in the Philippines, we have ratified the Paris Agreement into domestic law. It was approved by Senate. Other countries have not done that. So maraming depende, maraming nuancing on whether it's legally binding. But I think what's important is it's a treaty that has compelled parties to come back every year and negotiate for something. And even in this COP where there are a lot of frustrations, we have managed to have these nations that have built their economies on the backbone of fossil fuels sign an outcome that says transition away. Of course, that entailed a lot of sacrifice and compromise on
In
our
28
end.
years.
In 28 years. And all that. But yeah, we have parties coming to the table and signing those types of agreements. Diba? And I think there are ways to compel them.
Parang first time ko marinig yun na parang it's a strength that it's not. Tama ba yung pagkaintindi ko? It's a strength that it's not legally binding kasi parties come back, di ba?
That's one way of looking at it. In Kyoto Protocol, we've had countries withdraw
Because
it's binding and it's top down and it sets limitations on greenhouse gases, as opposed to Paris na you come up with your nationally determined contributions.
Right.
And that's why this COP is so important. Kasi now, we know that this approach has led to us being off track. Diba? Ito naman yung weakness. And the goal is, we say this is a GST COP. This is a COP that checks whether we're on track, and we know that we're off track. And so in the next COP, in the one after that, we're supposed to have enhanced NDCs. And the fact of the matter is, we can expect the parties to come again to that table and present more ambitious NDCs.
But when you look at it that way, parang there are wars going on. But still, nangyayari pa rin yung COP every year. Parang ang hirap pumili nung susunod na venue, pero nakapili pa rin ng venue, and parties always come back.
Yes.
Takeaway,
Yeah, unfortunately, the next venue is another oil-producing country. And malaki yung role nila, no? We saw it here. We saw it in the previous COP when a country that hosts the COP is one that's hugely dependent on fossil fuels. Diba? Ang layo nung building blocks sa final text.
For another discussion yung COP29.
Yeah, 29. Next year.
Next year, kita-kita ulit tayo.
So, now that COP28 has ended, for the Philippines, what steps should we take to honor the commitments that were made in COP28?
What should we do to honor the commitments?
Yeah.
For us, no, something that we've consistently asked the Philippine delegation to do, in and out of COP. Let's keep 1.5 within reach. And we know that the highest emitting sector is the power sector. That's why we're always starting there. We have a pathway. This administration has emphasized how its governance is science-based. And here we present a report that's science-based. As to the impacts of the climate, we can't talk about science, but really do we have to? We feel it, we experience it every day. Worse every year. So what do we do after the COP? We translate that into action, diba? So in our own shores, and we say this, we can't come to the negotiating tables and ask for loss and damage and ask for the highest ambition in NDCs and 1.5 if we're not doing it here.
Right.
Diba? And we can always talk about common but differentiated responsibilities and justice, but the truth of the matter is our people are suffering. And the more we delay, the more we say that we'd rather you suffer more up until we see these countries do it first? Or is it, for us, primary interest na maprotektahan natin yung mga kababayan natin, yung mga sarili natin, di ba? So, we have to adopt the highest ambition. Right now, it's still 35% renewable energy by 2030, 50 by 2040.
Tatasan na daw nila. Kakagaling ko lang sa forum kanina.
To what?
think.
To what
That's
percent?
I forgot.
To what percent?
Oo, tataas. Tinataas.
To what percent?
Mga 40 lang.
The 1.5 report says kulang ang doubling. Dapat 89% by
Tripling
2030.
talaga.
Tripling talaga.
So,
90 ba? 90 ba raw?
Ay, grabe naman yung 90.
Tripling
Parang,
eh.
iba naman yung wishful thinking. Anyway, so kauwi mo lang. I know, kauwi mo lang. Pero ano ba yung ine-expect natin for next year, for COP29? Or okay na bang sagutin mo yun? O gusto mo muna magpahinga muna? Kasi kababalik mo lang ng Dubai.
what do we expect from COP29? Siguro, coming from the frustrations of this COP, no, we expect another difficult COP because of where it's being hosted. But, ano kasi for me, kahit frustrating, I have renewed hope Kasi seeing all of the people who are there in this global movement coming together and what we've done collectively to have that into the text, it's all the buzz, diba, na this global momentum to end fossil fuels. It's here. So next COP, we expect that to be more evident, and that's only possible if we continue the work where we're at right now. Diba? This is where the work happens. And we continue building on that momentum, and it's gonna become inevitable in those negotiation halls. So exciting pa rin. We hope for a better text. We hope for means of implementation, finance, technology, all that, capacity building. But we hope also that the Philippine delegation will lead in having that strong voice in the negotiations. No? Kasi it was the AOCs, it was the small island states who were really the leaders for a fossil fuel phase out within the halls of the plenary. But we think we're in the same boat.
Right.
Tayo din. Grabe yung paghihirap natin sa climate crisis. So we hope we also lend that voice to our fellow climate vulnerable Filipinos.
Right. Thank you, Av, for taking the time for this episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
for
Din.
lending
Thanks for
us
having
our
me.
expertise. Yes. And that's a wrap. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any story ideas to pitch, you can reach us at Iya Gozum or at Jee Geronimo on X. See you in the next episode.
Bye.
Next year. Next year na.
Next year na.
Kasi last
Nagbabay na
episode
ako.
na namin. See you in the next episode next year. Merry Christmas.
Happy New
New
Year.
Year. Sana masarap ang Noche Buena nyo. Bye.
Bye.